Republicanos, el Bando Leal, los Rojos, who were the Republicans who fought against the Nationalists in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, from the onset of the coup in July right up until their final surrender to the nationalist forces of Francisco Franco. In this video I'd like to find out who were the Republicans of the Spanish Civil War. It is of course amongst the army generals that the coup that would become the Spanish Civil War starts, although some 87,000 Spanish troops did remain loyal to the Republican government. Although more than 50% joined the Nationalists, there were some 40% who did remain loyal to the Republicans and who fought on the Republican side during the Spanish Civil War. It's also true that the Republican Air Force, more than half of which did remain loyal to the Republicans, also played a key role in the early years of the war, as well as the Republican Navy. Although two of the most powerful ships, the aircraft carriers, did actually go over to the Nationalist side, the Republican Navy did, at least for the first few weeks, halt the Nationalist troops from arriving in mainland Spain. Despite almost having 90,000 troops still loyal to the Republican government, the government really didn't trust these troops very well, partially because so many troops had already rebelled and they feared that more would, and also because in the first few months of the war many of the troops did actually go over to the nationalist side when sent out to stop the rebels. So the government decided, quite controversially, to disband all the troops that remained loyal to the Republic. Instead, the government started to arm trade unions, who formed militias as the nationalist troops started to make headway across Spain. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers flocked to these militias and they were sent to the front line to fight against the nationalist advance. One of these organizations was the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or the National Confederation of Labour, which was a confederation of anarcho-syndicalist trade unions that had joined together and was a very powerful force in Spain at the time, working together under the initials of Frente. Now alongside them there were also the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, which is the Iberian Anarchist Federation. Now the Frente and the FAI, as they came collectively to be known, had once been the same organisation. The FAI had broken away because they were more radically against the Frente, but they banded together once again in 1936 to better promote the ideals of the anarchist revolution and to a lesser extent to fight against the nationalists who were slowly encroaching upon their territory. Now, as well as these guys, we have the Unión General de Trabajadores, which is the General Workers' Union, and this is more sort of towards the communist side of the left-wing spectrum, being linked also to Stalin and to the USSR. He started to get more and more influence there, which would become very important as the war went on. As the coup broke out in the cities of Spain, the UGT and the Frente armed their membership and fought back. The fate of a city and whether it would belong to the Republicans or the Nationalists, depending on how quickly and how well the various trade unions fought against the rebelling soldiers in these cities. And it's only thanks to the rising of these trade unions and the fact that they were armed and ready that actually there was a republic to fight against the Nationalists. Otherwise they simply would have won, because the Republican government itself was totally unprepared for such a coup to take place. While the Communists and the Anarchists both had the goal of bringing about social revolution, during the Spanish Civil War their goals were far enough apart that the two sides drifted apart and eventually even went to war with one another. The anarchists wanted to break down the state control of certain aspects of life and essentially to create a classless society within where there was no property for anyone, and they saw the increased militarization of the communists in their effort to fight against the nationalists as them trying to implement unjust control over the people, a sentiment they shared with the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. And just such a revolution did take place in several of the Spanish provinces, but mainly in Catalonia, in Valencia and in Aragon, as well as some areas in the far south in Andalusia, where the workers did indeed take over and a propertyless, classless society was for a time aimed at being created with the anarchists in control. But would Stalin and his fellow Spanish communists allow the situation to continue? No. While most anarchists saw the social revolution and the war as one and the same, the communists and the Republican government realised that to fight against the nationalists, the revolution would have to wait, and first they would have to mobilise and create some form of structure to fight back. Spanish communists were some of the first to arm up and fight back against the nationalists and were a great boon at the start of the war. This was so because they had close ties to the Soviet Union and to Joseph Stalin, because most Spanish communists were actually aligning with the Comintern and International Communism, as opposed to the Marxists, the POM, who were against Stalinist control over the communist parties in Spain, and they formed some of the earliest militias, the first regiments that went out to the front to halt the nationalist advance. And perhaps the best known is El Quinto Regimiento, which is the 5th Regiment, which is one of the most famous regiments and celebrated regiments. There's several songs been written about this on the Republican side, and who really held the line against the nationalists, especially during the Battle of Madrid, which is one of the few times that the nationalists were actually stopped in their offensives, and they were stopped several times at Madrid, which held out right until the end of the war. The communists became more important as the war progressed as well, because the Soviet Union was sending much needed support to the Spanish Republican government and was one of the only countries that openly did so. So the communists rose in significance in the Spanish Republican government as well as on the front lines and the battlefield. In October of 1936, the Republican government finally made a move to reorganize all the militias that had been sent higgledy-piggledy out to fight against the nationalists, which they were doing with really rather little success. So they created a new and reorganized army on the model of the Quinto Regimiento, and this was called El Ejército Popular Regular, which is the regular popular army. This army was to be put under the leadership of the Frente Popular, which was essentially the front of several left-wing parties that joined together to fight against the National Front, the right-wing equivalent, just before the outbreak of the coup in 1936, as well as under the control of the CNT and the UGT, so the communists and the anarchists, who then started to toe the line with the Republican government so that they could more effectively fight back. There were also nationalists who fought for the Republic, but before I go on, a quick disclaimer here. When I'm saying nationalist, I don't mean the nationalists like the guys that, were doing the Roman salute and were supporting Franco, who are often referred to as the nationalists, the guys who are rebelling, or the ones I made the video about, probably, I don't know when it'll be uploaded, some point, but not those guys. What I mean are the nationalists, as in the Catalan and the Basque nationalists from these areas in Spain. There are also some in Galicia, which is the part of Spain just above Portugal, but they're not as significant as the two from these regions. The Basques are a people from the northeast of Spain, as well as being across the border in France, and they are actually a linguistic minority, a very interesting one linguistically, because their language is non-Indo-European, and you'll probably see how strange it looks to Indo-European eyes in a little bit. And the Basques actually fought for the Republicans, but also for the nationalists, and this was because the Basque country, I believe still is, was incredibly Catholic, very strongly Catholic, and that didn't go well with a lot of the communist and anarchist factions who were very anti-Catholic and committed atrocities against the Catholic Church. So quite a few Basques also served with the Carlists, and the Carlists, as you will know if you saw my video on the nationalists, fought for the nationalists during the war and were strong on traditionalism and wanted the descendants of Don Carlos reinstated on the Spanish throne. But there were of course also Basques, and I think more Basques, who fought for the Republic, because the Republic promised more autonomy and perhaps even eventual independence to the Basque country, and did indeed give them more independence during the Spanish Civil War. And they did actually form up into several battalions to defend the Basque country, which very soon came under attack from nationalist forces. And they formed them up into and this is my best Basque, so you'll forgive me, Eusko Gudarastia. And this means the Basque Army, although eventually this army proved ineffective and they were defeated by the nationalist forces when they cut them off from the rest of the Republicans and took the northern patch of the Republican territory from them in, I think it's 1937. Catalonia, or to use the Spanish, and Catalan Catalunya, were also given a certain degree of autonomy during the Spanish Civil War, and this is where a lot of the anarchist things were happening until the May Days of 1936 or 37, when they were overthrown by the communists and the Republican government, and some order was restored to that area. And it was from Catalonia that a lot of the militias originated that went out to fight against the nationalist troops, and it's also here that George Orwell, the famous author, came and served not as part of one of the International Brigades because he wasn't a communist, but as a volunteer internationally. And many of the Catalan nationalists, who were a prominent force and very left-wing as they are today, were generally along the line of the communists to get the support from the Soviet Union, and also fought there, probably for more freedoms. Finally, there are the Brigadas Internacionales, or the International Brigades, which is an often romanticized part of the Spanish Civil War, and one which I made an English and a Spanish video about, I think 2 years ago now, if you want to check that out and see old school history with Hilbert, which I would recommend for a laugh. But essentially these were international brigades of international international volunteers that came over and fought for the Republic against the nationalists. And what these were always communists, because it was organised by the Communist Party, and lots of different nationalities took part. Here's a little chart that I composed based off information from a book that I was reading about the subject, with various battalions and brigades. There were lots of brigades that were multinational as well, and some of the largest numbers of nationalities that came and fought against Franco and his troops. And often these would form, some obviously would be larger battalions where there would be just with one nationality and several thousand in a battalion, or several hundred, and other times they would be more mixed with various nationalities and various battalions being added together with columns so that they made up a proper regiment and were sent out. And they were often really brutally trained in the camps, and the discipline was very harsh, so they were sometimes really quite good troops for the Republicans, but they seem to have been used quite badly by the commanders, and morale seems to have become quite low in these international brigades. And oftentimes when they went back to their countries, the Europeans of course would find themselves under Nazi occupation just a few years later, and this would become a real issue, as well as the fact that in countries like the Netherlands, if they went and fought for Spain, they became honorary Spanish citizens, so they lost their Dutch citizenship, which under occupation was a real issue. So many of these men and women that went and fought and served, they had really tragic stories after the Spanish Civil War, as well as the many thousands, tens of thousands who were killed. The international brigades were exclusively aligned to Stalin and to the communist lines of the USSR, and were set up by the Comintern. So those who disagreed with that form of communism, so many Marxists joined the POUM, for example, or the Trotskyists, as well as others. I believe George Orwell was an anarchist or a socialist. He wasn't quite a communist or not aligned to the USSR. So they formed different columns and different fighting units rather than the international brigades, which are more famous today. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching. This has been the rather, and hopefully not too confusing, factions of the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War, because this really is a large and confusing topic because there are so many, and I've done my very best to, one, get my head around it, and two, help you get your head around it, which I hope this video can help you to do. So if you're interested, then comment anything below, and I will try and get back to people with questions, or someone in the audience will, because you are all a fountain of knowledge, which is really good. I've tried my best with the Basque pronunciation. The Spanish should be alright if my A-levels are true to me. But if you want to see any more on this topic, just let me know. I've been thinking about composing a bit of a longer, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, documentary on the Spanish Civil War, if that's something people are interested in, but just let me know. As always, cards and things in the description to find out more, and leave me a thumbs up if you enjoyed. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Hasta la vista.